It was 53 minutes past 3 in the morning, in the black water at the northern mouth of the Surigao Strait in the Philippines. The date was the 25th of October, 1944. The American battleship West Virginia opened fire. She had been tracking her target on radar for nearly 40 minutes without ever seeing it, in a darkness so complete that the men on her bridge could not make out the water below them. At a range of about 22,000 yards, she fired 8 16-inch guns at a ship her crew had never laid eyes on. The first salvo hit. The target was the Japanese battleship Yamashiro, and within seconds the rest of the American line opened up as well. 6 battleships and a wall of cruisers firing full broadsides into the head of an enemy column that could only reply with its forward turrets. 18 minutes later, Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf ordered his gunners to cease fire because there was almost nothing left in front of them to shoot at. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura had entered that strait with 7 warships, including 2 battleships. When the sun came up, 1 destroyer had escaped. Everything else was on the bottom or burning its way toward it, and Nishimura himself was dead inside his flagship. It was the last time in the history of the world that battleships fought battleships, and it was less a battle than an execution carried out in stages. The trap he sailed into had been assembled with a kind of cold professionalism that is worth understanding properly. Oldendorf had not built a fair fight and had never intended to. He had built a machine for destroying a fleet in layers, with each layer feeding the next, and Nishimura had to pass through all of them in a channel too narrow to turn around in. And there was something else waiting for the Japanese in that strait, something that no naval planner could have designed, and that reads almost like the work of a novelist. Of the 6 American battleships lying across the exit that night, 5 had been present at Pearl Harbor when the war began. 5 of them had been bombed or torpedoed, and most had been sunk or beached in the mud of that harbor. They had been raised, patched, towed home, rebuilt, and sent back to the war. Almost 3 years later, the ships Japan had destroyed in the opening minutes of the conflict were sitting in the dark at the end of a channel, waiting for a Japanese battle line to come to them. But the annihilation of the Southern force did not begin in that strait. It begins 2 days earlier and hundreds of miles away, with a Japanese plan so complicated and so desperate that its own commanders privately doubted it could work. To see how Nishimura came to be there at all, you have to understand what Japan was attempting in October of 1944. The Americans had landed on the island of Leyte in the Philippines, which meant the invasion the entire empire had been dreading was underway. If the Philippines fell, the sea lanes bringing oil from the south to the home islands would be cut, and the war would effectively be over. So the Japanese Navy committed nearly everything it had left to a single operation designed to break the landing. What resulted became the largest naval battle ever fought, by almost any measure anyone cares to use. It sprawled across hundreds of miles of Philippine water over 4 days, involved hundreds of warships and more than 200,000 men, and consisted of 4 separate actions that historians still treat as distinct battles. Surigao Strait was one of those 4. It was fought on the same night, and in some cases in the same hours, as the others. The Japanese understood perfectly well that they were making a suicidal gamble, and their own signals said so. Sending old battleships without air cover against a defended landing area was not the plan of a navy that expected to survive. It was the plan of a navy that had decided it was better to be destroyed attacking than to sit in harbor and be destroyed at anchor. One senior Japanese admiral asked, when the plan was explained to him, whether there would be any purpose in preserving a fleet at the cost of losing the Philippines. Everyone involved knew the answer. The plan was called Shogo, and it divided the fleet into 3 parts. A decoy force of aircraft carriers, almost entirely empty of aircraft, would sail from the north to lure the powerful American Third Fleet away from the invasion area. A powerful center force under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita would come through the San Bernardino Strait from the north, and a southern force would push through the Surigao Strait from the south, so that the two surface forces would converge on the invasion shipping in Leyte Gulf from opposite directions and destroy it between them. Nishimura commanded that southern force, and it was the weakest of the three by a wide margin. He had the battleships Fuso and Yamashiro, both of which had been built during the First World War and modernized since, though they remained slow and old. He had the heavy cruiser Mogami and 4 destroyers. Against a defended strait, that was a small force to be sending anywhere. The two battleships deserve a proper look, because their age is part of the story. The Fuso and the Yamashiro had been laid down before and during the First World War, which made them the oldest battleships in Japanese service. They had been rebuilt in the 1930s with the enormous, ungainly pagoda masts that gave Japanese capital ships their distinctive look, towering structures of platforms and rangefinders stacked one above another. They carried 12 14-inch guns each, which was serious firepower, and they were slow, and their armour had been designed for a different era of naval gunnery. They had also seen almost no combat. Both had spent most of the war in home waters as training ships and reserves, considered too slow and too vulnerable for the fast carrier operations that had defined the Pacific campaign. Their crews were not the elite of the Japanese Navy. When they were finally committed to battle, it was for this operation, at the end of the war, in the least survivable role available. The Japanese Navy sent its 2 oldest and least useful battleships to force a defended strait, and lost both in a single night. There was a second Japanese force heading for the same strait, and the way it was handled says almost everything about the state of the Japanese command by that point in the war. Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima was coming down from the north with 2 heavy cruisers, a light cruiser, and destroyers. Shima did not report to Nishimura, and Nishimura did not report to Shima. They belonged to different commands. They had made no joint plan, they exchanged almost no useful signals, and they were separated by perhaps 40 miles. 2 Japanese forces were converging on the same narrow channel on the same night, with no coordination whatsoever. That failure was not an accident of communications. It was structural. The Japanese Navy had a long tradition of dividing its forces into separate commands with separate objectives, on the theory that complexity would confuse an enemy, and by this stage of the war, the habit had hardened into something close to a disease. Plans were built out of multiple detachments arriving from multiple directions on precise schedules, which looked elegant on a chart and required a level of coordination that radio silence and battle damage made impossible. Shima's force had originally been assigned to an entirely different mission and had been redirected south almost as an afterthought. He was senior to Nishimura in service, but junior in the relevant chain, and neither man had the authority to give the other orders. Rather than sort it out, the High Command left the 2 squadrons to work it out between themselves. And they did not. Shima chose to hang back roughly 40 miles and follow Nishimura in, which meant that instead of 2 forces attacking together, the Americans got to destroy one and then watch the other arrive too late to matter. Nishimura knew a great deal about what was in front of him, which is what makes his story remarkable rather than merely tragic. He had been attacked from the air during the day on the 24th and had taken damage. He knew the Americans had spotted him. He knew he had lost surprise entirely. He had no air cover of his own, because Japanese naval aviation had been destroyed over the Philippine Sea 4 months earlier and had never been rebuilt. He was steaming toward a defended strait at night in old ships without air support, against an enemy who was expecting him. Night fighting was the one field where the Japanese Navy could genuinely claim superiority, and that makes what happened even more pointed. In the early battles around Guadalcanal, Japanese cruisers and destroyers had repeatedly savaged American forces in night actions, using superb optics, relentless training, and the finest torpedo in the world. Their oxygen-powered torpedo could run further and hit harder than anything the Americans had, and in 1942 it had been a nightmare weapon. Japanese officers had spent years drilling for exactly the kind of confused, close-range, night surface fight that the Surigao Strait seemed to promise. Radar had quietly erased that advantage while they were not looking. Superb night vision through excellent binoculars is a wonderful thing, and it is worth almost nothing against an enemy who can see you from 24 miles away through total darkness and shoot accurately at 13. The skill the Japanese Navy had spent a generation building had been made obsolete by a machine, and the men steaming up that channel were about to discover it in the worst possible way. He went in anyway, and he went in on schedule at the appointed hour, exactly as ordered. Men who study this battle have argued for decades about why. Some point to the Japanese naval tradition of absolute obedience to a plan once it had been issued. Some point to the fatalism that had settled over the Japanese officer corps by that autumn, when every senior commander understood the war was lost, and the only question left was how to end honorably. Whatever moved him, the fact itself is not in dispute. Nishimura sailed into a killing ground with his eyes open. Waiting for him at the northern end was Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, and the force he commanded was not a fleet in the ordinary sense. It was the fire support and escort group of the invasion, ships whose job was to bombard beaches and protect transports. They were slow, they were mostly old, and they had spent days pounding the shore. But there were a great many of them, and Oldendorf had roughly 36 hours of warning that a Japanese force was coming his way. What he did with those hours is the reason this battle is still taught in naval academies. Rather than steam out to meet the enemy, Oldendorf used the geography, and the geography was extraordinary. The Surigao Strait is a long, narrow channel between islands, and a force entering from the south has to come up it in a column. There is very little room to maneuver, almost no room to turn a battle line around, and only one way out at the far end. It is, in the plainest terms, a funnel. So Oldendorf built his defence in layers, one behind another, and designed it so that a fleet coming up that funnel would have to pass through every single one. The first layer, furthest south, was 39 patrol torpedo boats. These were small, fast wooden craft carrying torpedoes and machine guns, and Oldendorf spread them in groups down the length of the strait and out into the approaches. Their job was not primarily to sink anything. Their job was to find the enemy in the dark, report his position, course and speed by radio, and then harass him as he came. They were the eyes of the trap. The men who crewed those boats had one of the strangest jobs in the Navy. A patrol torpedo boat was about 80 feet of plywood powered by aircraft engines, capable of astonishing speed and offering its crew no protection whatever. Attacking a battleship in one was roughly comparable to attacking a tank with a motorcycle. They did it repeatedly through that night, running in under searchlights and heavy gunfire to launch torpedoes, and their reward was to be shot at by everything in the Japanese column at once. Oldendorf had spread 13 sections of them across some 50 miles of water, which meant that from the moment the Japanese entered the southern approaches, there was essentially nowhere they could go without being seen. Each section had orders to attack if it could, and to report regardless. That reporting requirement was the real mission, and the boat captains understood it. They were being used as a tripwire strung across an ocean. The second layer was destroyers, and this was the killing layer. though very few people would have guessed it at the time. Oldendorf positioned squadrons of destroyers along both sides of the strait, tucked against the shorelines where they would be hard to see. As the Japanese column came up the middle, the destroyers would dash out from the flanks in the darkness, launch torpedoes at close range, and turn away behind smoke before the enemy guns could find them. Each destroyer carried 10 torpedoes. Attacking from both flanks at once, from a position the enemy could not anticipate, they represented an enormous concentration of underwater firepower. The doctrine behind that attack was itself a lesson learned the hard way. Early in the war, American destroyers had generally been kept tied to the battle line or used defensively, and in the night battles around Guadalcanal, that caution had cost them dearly against Japanese squadrons that attacked aggressively with torpedoes. American officers had studied those defeats carefully. By 1944, the destroyer torpedo attack had been rebuilt into a precise and rehearsed operation, with squadrons trained to close, fire, and withdraw behind smoke on a timed schedule. Oldendorf's orders to his destroyer commanders reflected that. They were to attack in successive waves down both sides of the channel, launch at around 4 miles, and get clear immediately without lingering to observe results. Each wave would hit a column that was already reacting to the previous one. It was designed to arrive as a series of shocks rather than a single blow, and the destroyer captains who received those orders knew exactly what was being asked of them. The third layer, across the northern exit, was the battle line. 6 battleships and a heavy force of cruisers, American and Australian, drawn up in a line at right angles to the channel. This is the formation naval officers call crossing the T, and it is the oldest dream in the book of naval gunnery. The enemy comes up the stem of the T in column, able to fire only his forward guns. The defender sits across the top, able to fire every gun he possesses. The advantage is not marginal, it is total. Oldendorf had one further problem, and it is the sort of thing that never appears in the legend. His ships were short of the right ammunition. They had spent the previous days bombarding the invasion beaches, which meant their magazines were heavy with high-explosive shells suited to shore targets and light on the armor-piercing shells needed to punch through a battleship's hull. Some of his ships had only a fraction of the armor-piercing rounds they would want for a fleet action. He gave orders that fire was to be deliberate and controlled, because he could not afford a long gunnery duel. Jesse Oldendorf himself is one of those officers whose name almost nobody outside the Navy recognizes, which is rather the point of him. He was 60 years old, a career surface officer who had come up through cruisers and had spent most of the war doing the unglamorous work of escort and bombardment, rather than commanding carriers. He was not colourful. He did not give quotable interviews. What he was, by universal agreement of the people who worked with him, was extremely competent and extremely thorough. The plan he produced in a day and a half reflects exactly that temperament. There is no flourish in it anywhere. It identifies the enemy's only possible route, places a detection screen along it, positions the torpedo forces where they can attack from angles the enemy cannot cover, and puts the heavy ships in the one formation that guarantees maximum firepower against minimum reply. Then it adds contingencies for what to do if the enemy turns back, or comes through in 2 groups, or breaks past the destroyers. It is the work of a man who intends to leave nothing whatever to chance, which is the correct way to fight a battle you have been handed the advantage in. There was a second limitation that mattered even more, and it concerned radar. Of the 6 battleships, only 3 carried the newest fire control radar sets capable of accurate blind shooting at long range in total darkness. The other 3 had older equipment, and in the event they would contribute very little to the shooting. The battle line looked overwhelming on paper. In practice, its striking power that night rested on 3 ships. Nishimura entered the southern approaches to the strait late on the evening of the 24th, and at about 10:30 the patrol boats found him. From that moment on, the Japanese force was never again out of American sight for long. Boat after boat came racing in to attack, was driven off by gunfire and searchlights, and fell back to report what it had seen. Radio messages flowed north to Oldendorf, building a continuous picture of the enemy's position, course and speed as he came. The attacks themselves accomplished nothing at all in material terms. Across the entire night, the patrol boats fired dozens of torpedoes and did not hit a single Japanese ship. They lost men doing it, and 1 boat was destroyed. What they achieved was something else entirely, and it was worth far more. They handed Oldendorf a running commentary on his enemy's approach, and they gave Nishimura several hours of harassment that told him precisely nothing he could act on. Those hours had a cost for the Japanese that does not appear in any casualty list. A warship crew that has been at action stations all night, repeatedly attacked, repeatedly firing at shadows, is a tired crew. Searchlights had been burning, guns had been manned, damage control parties had been standing by, and men had been keyed up for hours by the time the real fighting started. The patrol boats had not sunk anything, but they had ensured that the Japanese arrived at the killing zone exhausted and already jumpy. They had also stripped away any remaining possibility of surprise. Nishimura's one theoretical advantage entering that strait had been the darkness, the chance that he might get among the invasion shipping before anyone realized he had come through. From 10:30 at night onward, that was gone. The Americans knew where he was, how fast he was moving, and roughly when he would arrive, and they had time to make final adjustments to a plan that was already complete. Nishimura pressed on regardless, and at about 2 in the morning, he formed his ships into battle order for the run up the channel. He signalled his intentions north to Kurita and to Shima, reporting that he was engaging torpedo boats and that his advance continued. Then he took his column up the middle of the strait at 20 knots, straight between the 2 lines of waiting destroyers, and the second layer of the trap closed on him. The destroyer attack began just before 3 in the morning, and it was one of the most devastating single actions in the history of surface warfare. Squadrons came in from both sides at once, ran to within about 4 miles, fired full salvos of torpedoes into the Japanese column, and turned away hard behind smoke screens. Japanese searchlights swept the water, and their guns opened up, but the American ships were already zigzagging away into the dark. The torpedoes arrived in the Japanese column a few minutes later. The destroyer Yamagumo was hit and exploded so violently that the flash was seen from the American battle line miles away, her own torpedoes evidently detonating in the blast. The destroyer Mishishio was crippled. The destroyer Asagumo had her bow blown off, and the battleship Fuso, second ship in the line, was struck on the starboard side and fell out of formation, burning. The Fuso did not survive the night. She drifted out of the battle, blazing, and sank before dawn. For decades, the standard account held that she blew up and broke in 2, with both halves floating and burning separately, and that story is repeated almost everywhere. Modern research on the wreck and on Japanese records has cast real doubt on it, and the better supported version is simply that she was torpedoed, caught fire, and went down. What is certain is that a battleship of the Imperial Japanese Navy was destroyed by a torpedo attack from destroyers before the enemy battle line had fired a single shot. That is the fact that the popular version of this battle tends to lose, and it deserves to be said plainly. The southern force was broken by torpedoes in the dark, delivered by small ships, before the great guns ever entered the story. By the time Nishimura came within range of Oldendorf's battleships, he had already lost one battleship, one destroyer sunk outright, and two more destroyers crippled. He was down to his flagship, a heavy cruiser, and a single intact destroyer. The Yamashiro herself had taken at least one torpedo by then. She was flooding and slowed, and Nishimura had a clear picture of what was happening to his command. He sent a signal reporting the torpedo damage and stating that his battle integrity was not impaired. Then he ordered his surviving ships to continue north. That is where the first half of this story ends, with a wrecked squadron pressing on toward a line of battleships that had been raised from the mud of Pearl Harbor. It took 8 hours to get every name and number in this story right, because the popular version of Surigao credits the wrong ships with the killing and repeats a story about the Fuso that modern research no longer supports. If this is the history you want more of, hit like, nothing more. Thank you. Across the northern exit of the strait, the American battle line had been tracking the approach for some time without seeing anything at all. The night was pitch black. There was no moon that mattered, no starlight to speak of, and the Japanese ships were still far beyond the range of any human eye. What the Americans had instead was radar, and by 1944, the best American naval radar was very good indeed. At about 16 minutes past 3, the West Virginia's fire control radar picked up the incoming ships at a range of 42,000 yards, which is roughly 24 miles. She began tracking them. For the next 35 minutes, the American line held its fire and simply watched the plot, calculating course and speed, refining the solution, and waiting for the range to close. It is a strange thing to picture, a battleship in total darkness, silent, following an enemy she cannot see as he walks steadily into her guns. Then the guns spoke. The West Virginia's opening salvo struck the Yamashiro squarely. Within moments, the other radar-equipped battleships joined in, and the cruiser line opened up along the flanks, and the whole northern end of the strait lit up. What the Japanese experienced in those minutes is almost beyond imagining. They were steaming up a narrow channel in the dark, already torn apart by torpedo attacks from an enemy they could barely see, and suddenly heavy shells began arriving out of nothing. There were no muzzle flashes to aim at initially, because the range was too great, and the American ships were hulled down in the darkness. The Yamashiro was being hit repeatedly by fire that seemed to come from nowhere, delivered with an accuracy that no Japanese gunner could match at that range and in those conditions. She fought back. That should be recorded properly, because it took courage of an extraordinary kind. The Yamashiro trained her forward turrets on the gun flashes that eventually became visible and returned fire. And she kept steaming north, and she kept firing as she was pounded from ahead and from both flanks at once. The Mogami fired too. So did the destroyer Shigure. 3 ships against 6 battleships and a line of cruisers, and the destroyers still working around the edges. The gunnery phase lasted about 18 minutes. In that time, the American battle line and its cruisers fired several hundred large-caliber shells into the head of the Japanese column. The West Virginia alone fired 93 16-inch rounds. The Yamashiro was struck again and again, her upper works wrecked, fires spreading through her. At about 11 minutes past 4, with his own destroyers still in the area and reports of friendly ships being straddled by American fire, Oldendorf ordered a general ceasefire. Even by that stage, the battle line's contribution needs to be put in proportion, and the American records make it clear enough. 3 of the 6 battleships did nearly all the shooting, because only they had the radar to do it. The Mississippi, one of those with older equipment, fired a single full salvo late in the action, and it has a curious distinction in history. That salvo is generally reckoned to be the last one ever fired by a battleship at another battleship in the history of naval warfare. It was aimed at a ship that was already dying. The Yamashiro turned to withdraw, torn open by torpedoes and shells, and she did not get far. She capsized and sank at around 19 minutes past 4 in the morning, taking Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura down with her. Of a crew of more than 1,500 men, only a handful survived. Nishimura's body was never recovered, and he remains where his flagship went down, in the middle of the strait he had been ordered to force. There is a detail about the man that is widely repeated and worth handling carefully. Nishimura's son, a young officer, had been killed earlier in the war, and many accounts suggest that the loss left him fatalistic and indifferent to his own survival. That is offered as an explanation for the almost mechanical way he drove his squadron into a hopeless position. It may well be true, and it appears in serious histories, but it is the kind of psychological reading that is impossible to verify about a man who left no explanation and did not come back. What can be said with confidence is what he did. He received an order that required him to force a defended strait without air cover at night against a superior force that was expecting him. He did not argue, delay, or seek to coordinate his approach with the second Japanese force nearby. He signaled his position and intentions to his superiors, formed his ships into battle order, and went in at 20 knots. Whatever was in his mind, he carried out the mission exactly as issued, and it killed him and almost everyone with him. The Mogami, burning heavily and out of control, staggered south out of the battle. The destroyer Shigure, the only ship of the entire southern force still in fighting condition, also turned and ran for the southern exit. She made it. Alone out of 7 warships, the Shigure came through that night, and she has a strange reputation in Japanese naval history as a lucky ship, having survived several battles that destroyed everything around her. Her captain's report afterward became famous within the Japanese Navy for a single sentence. Asked to account for what had happened to the squadron, he replied that he had no report to make, because all ships except the Shigure had gone down. It is about as complete a summary of a naval disaster as anyone has ever produced. An entire force had been sent into a strait, and the only officer left to describe it had watched every other ship in his formation die around him, without being able to do anything at all about it. And then, at about 25 minutes past 4, the second Japanese force finally arrived, and its performance was the perfect summary of the entire Japanese effort that night. Vice Admiral Shima came up the strait with his cruisers, entirely unaware of the details of what had just happened to Nishimura, because the two forces had never established proper communication. He ran into burning wreckage. He saw 2 large masses of fire on the water, which he took to be the wrecks of both Japanese battleships, and the sight told him everything he needed to know. His cruisers fired torpedoes at radar contacts, hit nothing, and turned to retire. In the confusion of that withdrawal, Shima's flagship, the heavy cruiser Nachi, collided with the crippled Mogami, which was still moving, and which the Nachi's crew had apparently assumed was dead in the water. Both ships were damaged in the collision. The Mogami, already wrecked, was attacked from the air later that morning and finally scuttled. Shima withdrew with what he had left, so the arithmetic of that night reads as follows. Nishimura took 7 warships into the Surigao Strait. He lost both battleships, 3 destroyers, and eventually the heavy cruiser as well. 1 destroyer escaped. The second Japanese force accomplished nothing, collided with its own side and retreated. Something over 4,000 Japanese sailors died in that channel. American losses were 1 patrol torpedo boat, 1 destroyer badly damaged by friendly fire, and around 40 men killed. That exchange rate is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is not the sort of thing that happens between competent opponents. Roughly 100 men lost for every 1,000 of the enemy is not a battle result. It is what happens when one side has arranged the entire encounter in advance and the other side walks into it under orders. The survivors were pitifully few. From the Yamashiro's complement of well over 1,500, only about 10 men lived. From the Fuso, similarly, almost nobody. American ships in the area picked up some Japanese sailors from the water, and a number of others reportedly refused rescue, either from the conviction that surrender was dishonorable or from simple despair. Many of those who did survive did so by swimming to the shores of nearby islands. The great majority of the men who entered that strait never left it. Hit subscribe right now, because coming up is the part of this story that is almost too neat to be true. The ships in that American line that had been sunk by Japan 3 years earlier and came back. Do not go anywhere. Look at the names of the 6 battleships that closed the northern end of that strait, and then look at where they were on the morning of the 7th of December, 1941. The West Virginia, which fired the first radar-directed salvo and hit with it, had been struck by torpedoes at Pearl Harbor and had settled onto the harbor bottom. The California had been torpedoed and had sunk at her moorings over the following days. The Tennessee had been bombed and pinned in place by the wreckage of the ships around her. The Maryland had been bombed. The Pennsylvania, which was Oldendorf's flagship that night, had been in dry dock and had been hit as well. Only the Mississippi, which had been in the Atlantic on that morning, had not been present. 5 of the 6 had been damaged or sunk by the Japanese Navy in the attack that started the war. Salvage crews spent months in the oil and the mud of that harbor, pumping them out, patching torpedo holes and refloating hulls that had been written off. They went back to shipyards on the west coast and were rebuilt, in several cases far more thoroughly than they had ever been modernized in peacetime, with new anti-aircraft batteries and new fire control and the radar that would matter so much on this particular night. And on that October night, those same ships lay across the exit of a Philippine channel and destroyed the last battle line the Imperial Japanese Navy would ever send anywhere. There is no evidence that anybody planned that symmetry, and the officers involved seem to have been far too busy to dwell on it at the time. But the men aboard those ships understood exactly what they were doing. A great many of them had been at Pearl Harbor personally, and had pulled shipmates out of the water and had spent 3 years waiting. The salvage work that made it possible is one of the least celebrated feats of American engineering in the entire war. Divers went down into flooded compartments in oily black water, working by touch, recovering bodies and patching hull breaches from the inside. The West Virginia had taken multiple torpedoes and had to be sealed, pumped out, and refloated over months of continuous effort. The California, sunk at her berth, required similar work. Ships that any reasonable observer would have written off as total losses were brought back to the surface, one compartment at a time. Then they were modernized in a way that turned out to matter enormously. The rebuilt battleships came out of the yards with new secondary batteries, vastly increased anti-aircraft armament, and modern fire control radar. In several cases, they were more capable ships in 1944 than they had been in 1941. The Japanese attack that sank them had, in the end, forced the United States Navy to rebuild them into better weapons than they were before, and then those weapons were used to destroy a Japanese battle line. There is one more thing about that night that needs to be told, because it is the piece almost every telling of Surigao leaves out, and it changes the emotional shape of the whole thing. While Oldendorf was annihilating Nishimura in the south, a disaster was taking shape 150 miles to the north. Kurita's center force, the strongest of the three Japanese groups, had come through the San Bernardino Strait unopposed, because Admiral Halsey had taken the American fast carriers north after the empty Japanese decoy carriers. At dawn on that same morning, Kurita's battleships and cruisers fell upon a small group of American escort carriers and destroyers off the island of Samar. The calls for help went out across the whole area, and they reached Oldendorf. And he could not come. He was at the wrong end of the operation, well over 100 miles away, with slow battleships that had just fought a night action and had burned through a great deal of their armor-piercing ammunition. He organized what he could and started north, and it was never going to be in time. The desperate charge of a handful of tin cans off Samar, which is one of the most extraordinary actions in the history of the United States Navy, happened because the only heavy American surface force in the area had spent the night winning a perfect victory in the wrong strait. There is no blame to assign for that, and it is important to say so. Oldendorf had been given a mission and had executed it about as well as any admiral has ever executed anything. He could not be in two places, and the Japanese plan had been specifically designed to make sure he would not be. Sending a force through the southern strait was intended to pull the American heavy ships south, while the real blow came from the north. And in the narrowest sense, that part of the Japanese plan actually worked. The southern force was annihilated, and it still did its job, because it drew the battleships away from the place where they turned out to be needed. That is the uncomfortable symmetry of the whole night. Japan lost a squadron in the south and got exactly the diversion it wanted. Then it threw away the opportunity anyway when Kurita, confused and battered by the very escort ships he was slaughtering, turned around and retreated before reaching the invasion beaches. Both halves of the Japanese plan were paid for in full, and neither achieved anything at all. Here is how it unfolded in order. 22nd of October, 1944. Nishimura sails from Borneo with the southern force as part of Japan's three-pronged plan to smash the Leyte landing. Evening of the 24th, American patrol torpedo boats find the Japanese in the southern approaches and begin reporting their position continuously. Around 3 in the morning, in the dark of the strait, American destroyers attack from both flanks with torpedoes, sinking a destroyer, crippling 2 more, and mortally damaging the battleship Fuso. Just before 4 in the morning, the American battle line opens fire by radar at 22,000 yards and hits the Yamashiro with its first salvo. 11 minutes past 4, Oldendorf orders a ceasefire after roughly 18 minutes of gunnery, with the Japanese column destroyed. 25 minutes past 4, Shima's force arrives, finds burning wreckage, collides with the crippled Mogami, and retreats. The factors behind that annihilation are worth naming plainly. The first factor was the ground, and Oldendorf chose it. A narrow strait with one exit removed the enemy's freedom to maneuver entirely, and a fleet that cannot maneuver is a fleet that can only be shot at. The second factor was the layered ambush. Patrol boats to find and report, destroyers to attack with torpedoes from both flanks, and only then the battle line. Each layer weakened the enemy for the next, and by the time the guns spoke, the outcome had already been settled. The third factor was radar, both for detection and for gunnery. It allowed the Americans to track and engage a force they could not see at ranges where the enemy could not answer, and it is the single technical advantage that made the final phase so one-sided. The fourth factor was Japanese command failure. 2 forces sailing to the same place on the same night with no joint plan, no air cover, no surprise, and no serious hope was not a tactical problem. It was an organization giving orders it knew could not succeed. Strip away the maps and the casualty counts, and the destruction of Japan's southern force comes down to a single reversal worth stating plainly. For 20 years, the Imperial Japanese Navy had trained for one thing above all others: the decisive engagement between battle lines, fought gun to gun, in which superior seamanship and superior courage would settle the war in an afternoon. On that October night in the Philippines, they finally got it. They got the battleship duel they had built their entire doctrine around, the last one that would ever be fought, and they got it on the wrong side of the T, in a channel with no exit, against ships they had already sunk once. The battle they had dreamed of for a generation lasted about 18 minutes. There is a second reversal folded inside the first, and it belongs to the small ships. Everybody remembers Surigao as the last clash of the great battleships, and in a technical sense that is exactly what it was. But the battleships did not destroy the southern force. Destroyers did, with torpedoes in the dark, before the heavy guns ever opened. The final gun action was a coronation rather than a battle. The age of the battleship ended in a night action where the decisive weapon was a torpedo fired from a ship a fraction of the size. The Shigure, the one survivor, did not survive long. She was torpedoed and sunk by an American submarine in the Gulf of Siam some 3 months later, which closed the account on Nishimura's squadron entirely. Vice Admiral Shima survived the war. He had brought his force into an unwinnable situation, seen the wreckage of an Allied squadron burning on the water, and made the decision to withdraw rather than add his ships to the pile. And history has been reasonably kind to that judgment, even though it ended his career. The American battleships that fought there had short futures too, in the way that all battleships did after 1945. Several of them fired their guns in support of the landings at Iwo Jima and Okinawa in the months that followed, doing the shore bombardment work that had become the real job of a battleship. Then the war ended, and within a few years most were sold for scrap or expended as targets. Some were used in the atomic tests at Bikini, which is a strange fate for ships that had survived Pearl Harbor and had come back to win the last gun battle of the age. One of them escaped that ending. The West Virginia opened the shooting at Surigao and hit with her first salvo. She was eventually broken up, but pieces of her were preserved, and part of her mast stands today on a university campus in the state she was named for. Sailors from the ships that were raised out of the mud at Pearl Harbor spent the rest of their lives being asked about the morning the war started. Rather fewer of them were ever asked about the night they finished a Japanese battle line in a dark channel in the Philippines, which is a pity, because they were there for both. Because that is what Surigao was. No battleship has fired its main battery at another battleship since that night, anywhere in the world, and no navy has crossed an enemy's T in a fleet action since. The tactic that admirals had studied and rehearsed since the days of sail was executed one final time, perfectly, in a dark Philippine channel, and then it was never needed again. Aircraft and submarines had already taken the job, as the rest of that same battle demonstrated within hours. It is worth spelling out how completely the 4 actions of that week made the point. The largest battleship ever built, the Musashi, was sunk by carrier aircraft in the Sibuyan Sea. The Japanese carriers to the north were destroyed by carrier aircraft off Cape Engano. A Japanese heavy cruiser was torpedoed by an American submarine before the fighting even properly began. And in the one action where battleships did fight battleships in the traditional way, the decisive damage was done by destroyers with torpedoes before the big guns opened fire. Everything about that week said the same thing to anyone paying attention. The capital ship that had defined naval power for half a century, that nations had bankrupted themselves building, that treaties had been written to limit and admirals had built entire careers around, had been relegated to 2 roles. It could bombard a beach, and it could serve as an enormous anti-aircraft platform for the carriers that now mattered more. The gun duel at Surigao was not the opening of a new chapter. It was the last page of an old one. and everybody who fought it went straight back to escorting aircraft carriers the next morning. And at the bottom of the Surigao Strait, in water several hundred feet deep, the wrecks are still there. Expeditions have found the Fuso and the Yamashiro on the seabed, along with the destroyers. More than 4,000 Japanese sailors went down in that channel in a single night, most of them inside ships that never had a realistic chance of getting through, sent by a command that understood the odds perfectly well and ordered the attempt anyway. The strait itself has gone back to being what it was, a busy stretch of water between Philippine islands, with ferries and fishing boats crossing it daily. Most of the people who live along those shores have no particular reason to think about what happened there, and the wrecks lie far enough down that they trouble nobody. It is one of the quieter graveyards of the Pacific War, without a memorial that most visitors would ever see, and that is somehow appropriate for this battle, which has always lived in the shadow of the fighting off Samar that happened a few hours later and 150 miles north. Surigao was the perfect battle, planned and executed without a serious error, and perfect battles are not what people tell stories about. The story people tell is the one where 13 small ships charged a fleet and somehow lived. The night before it, in a dark channel to the south, an American admiral did everything correctly and destroyed an enemy squadron for the loss of about 40 men. And almost nobody has heard of him. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because every week we tell you how America actually won its war, the perfect victories and the ones that history has quietly rewritten, without the myths and without the easy exaggeration. Hit subscribe, then like, so this reaches more people who should know what really happened in that strait. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We will see you in the next one.